visits with its aircraft carriers involving far more ships and thousands more sailors. But it seems with China's growing military might, we're going to see more visits by Chinese warships here, by newer ships, and by bigger ships in the future. Robert Bride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
So you can see that the very veiled threat being made by this Chinese admiral. Now this has attracted a lot of attention. They call it gunboat diplomacy, China style, and it has generated some headlines like it's heightening tensions. This is in Australia, and in the Philippines, a very prominent Phil-American, and she's a businesswoman, Lloyd Nicholas Lewis, started an organization there. This they call the U.S. Pinoys for Good Governance. And what they did there in May, they started a campaign to have demonstrations in front of Chinese embassies and Chinese consulates, not only in the United States, but also in Canada and maybe about 20 other countries where there is a very strong Filipino presence. And they're very successful. In fact, last month, they were over here, and we had a prayer rally. They invited me also to speak there. Then the prayer rally simultaneous with prayer rallies in about 20 countries where there's a very strong Filipino presence. Now this is the South China Sea, and we must relate this not only to the Philippines and China, but relate this to the entire geography of the area. You can see that there are big players there. There is Japan, there's South Korea, of course Taiwan is there, there is Indonesia, it's not claimant, but it's very close to the possible point of conflict. And if we go to the Indian Ocean, then of course there's India, which traditionally is also in conflict with China. In fact, there had a big war back in 1962, I think, where China clovered India in that war, which India will never forget until now. So, Stratfor came out with the rise of an article by Robert Kaplan, the rise of the naval rise of China. U.S.-China on collision course in the Asia-Pacific waters. These are samples of the headlines that I've been monitoring on the situation, because this has attracted really big international attention, not only here in the Asia-Pacific area, but all over Europe, of course, here in India, in Canada, in Australia. So look at the headlines. U.S. pivot may steer Asian activities. This is the declaration of President Obama of the pivot to Asia. And part of the declaration of the pivot to Asia is that they're going to shift by 2020 60% of their naval forces from the European area to the Philippines, to the South Pacific area. Pentagon sends more warships to Pacifics. China state papers warn U.S. strategy. There's a warning also. There's big exchanges of warnings coming from both sides. Now, let's look at the potential conflict in terms of China-U.S. military balance. In terms of budget, there's no comparison, because the defense budget of the U.S. is more than about 10 times the defense budget of China. But remember, the defense budget of the U.S. is global for the entire world. The defense budget of China is focused on the Pacific area. So he may be the big player in this area unless the U.S. will succeed in transferring most of their assets in the Asian area. The budget of China is $78 billion. This was as of 2010. U.S. is $729 billion. In percent of GDP, it is 2% of China's GDP and 4.3% of the U.S. GDP. In terms of active personnel, China has 2.26 million, but a lot of that will be land-based, and the U.S. has 1.58 million. In terms of equipment, 1,320 fighters for China. These are fighter planes, and 2,379 fighters for the United States. And if we look at this, I saw a military analysis of the top 10 air forces in the world. And I was surprised to find out that China's air force is not ranked in the top 10. In fact, South Korea is even superior. Japan's air force is even superior. Swedish air force is even superior. And the US is vastly superior. There is no comparison as far as air force capability is concerned. Stealth fighters, China has 0, US has 139. In terms of aircraft carriers, as of now, China has 0 operational carrier, although they have one already that they have converted but not yet operational, against 11 for the United States, 65 submarines against 71 for the US, destroyers 27 against 57 for the US, and in terms of nuclear warhead, 240 for China and 9,400 for the United States. China is developing the Dongfeng, the Philippines has 0 nuclear warhead. US submarine docks at Subic, and they made a big thing out of it. Some people are saying that this is just a routine visit. And then they announced that the US is developing a $3 billion stealth destroyer, which is portrayed in Washington Post as the answer to rising China. And they describe this in very frightening terms. Then the statements of Senators Levin, McCain, and Webb on the CSIS report. These are the members of the US Senate that have been very vocal in making statements with regard to China and the South China Sea. Then Vietnam is, of course, in the picture. They have slammed as absurd Chinese protests over the islands, anti-China protesters taking to the streets in Hanoi. They're very active there. In fact, they're very emotional because Paracels, which is a big piece of property, were land grabbed by China right after the Vietnam War in 1974, resulting in deaths. In 1988, there was an encounter between the PLA Navy and the Vietnamese Navy, resulting in about more than 70 Vietnamese sailors killed in that encounter. And importantly, 3 Vietnamese ships were sunk. Aneta sends message to China during his historic visit to Vietnam. And then Japan is in the picture. Japan is very interested because the freedom of navigation matter is very crucial to them. This is a life or death proposition for Japan because there are about 200 major ships passing through the South China Sea every day. And they account for a big portion of the global trade. And a lot of that would be very vital strategic commodities like oil, going to Taiwan, going to South Korea, and going to Japan. So this is a casus belli in case the legal in case that choke point is blocked by any hostility there or by any hostile move on the part of any power. China on mine, India, Japan, South Korea hold a trilateral. South Korea to sign a military pact with Japan. They were on the verge of signing, but this ran into a lot of political problems inside South Korea because of what happened in South Korea, 50 years occupation by Japan, and this is a sore part of the history of South Korea. So this never came to pass, this proposed military pact. Mainland and Taiwan, we don't know how Taiwan would behave in case of a conflict with mainland China. Some people are speculating that in the end, Taiwan and mainland China would be aligned with each other with respect to the South China Sea. Australia is also in the picture, and they urge that the UN Law of the Sea be honored in arbitrating the South China Sea. If this is the one that would govern the resolution of the South China Sea conflict, then we will surely win. There is no doubt about it, because it's very clear that our exclusive economic zone includes part of the Spratlys and, of course, Mischief Reef, and very much so, the Scarborough Shoal. China warns on US-Australian ties. There was a report that 2,500 Marines will be based in Australia. It's far away, but China is already reacting to this. India is in the picture. is getting involved in China-Philippines territorial conflict. You know how it is. A friend of my, an enemy of the friend of my enemy is my enemy also. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That is how this thing is very parallel. It's almost like politics, except that we're talking here instead of individuals, instead of political parties, we're talking of countries. India displayed their power, and India is a very powerful country right now economically. Indian warships sail through South China Sea. India prepares to counter China's clout with INS Sapura, which is a stealth destroyer, stealth frigate. This is how it looks like, and they think that this can be more than a match for any other frigate of the PLA Navy. US-China woo India for control over the Asia Pacific. Of course, China would not discount the possibility of India becoming an ally also. So you see, these things are becoming more and more complicated. India, Indonesia back freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Indonesia also came into the picture. The Natuna Sea is in the southern border of the South China Sea. So this is a matter of concern also for Indonesia. Malaysia is also has come into the picture and hails America's move as very timely. In fact, Malaysia is in favor of using UNCLOS in settling this dispute. Now, one big complication that has happened is a very new declaration of China. The declaration of a new city, the Shanxia city in the South China Sea. It is a new prefecture based in the Paracels area, and this is their, they have some kind of a city hall. There already, you can see that this is not a small structure. This is a major structure by international standards that is supposed to be the capital of the Shanxia city. And they're going to set up a local government there. They're going to set up a garrison of about 10,000 soldiers, which is much bigger than the garrison in Hong Kong. China takes the gloves off. China to formally garrison disputed South China Sea. This is Shanxia, which includes the South China Sea, the part of the South China Sea that we are claiming. And of course, the United States very quickly criticized this new China garrison as a development that would increase the tension in the area. China strongly opposes U.S. State Department statement on the South China Sea. So there's another counter statement, etc., etc. Has the South China Sea reached a boiling point? If you read the headlines, it was almost like reading the book Winds of War by Herman Hoppe. You know, all these headlines that happened in Europe before the outbreak of the war in Europe, with Germany at that time becoming a very assertive power. And they're likening the moves of China now, similar to what Germany was doing before the start of the Second World War, and what Imperial Japan was doing when they started getting into the Manchuria area of China. Asia-ASEAN path to economic union muddied by South China Sea. For the first time in the 45 history of the ASEAN, they had their foreign ministers meeting in Cambodia, and for the first time they did not come out with a communique because of conflict on how to treat the South China Sea, on invoking UNCLOS there, and some people are saying that the reason for that is because Cambodia, which is the host country, prevented the issuance of the communique because of the strong representations by China. And Indonesia, yeah, that's right, that's in the papers 2 days ago. Indonesia came into the picture the same day. The foreign minister went into a shop of diplomacy a la Kissinger, went to the Philippines, went to Cambodia, went to other countries, and was able to come out with a belated communique, which essentially reflected what we wanted to say in the ASEAN talks. And that headline, "Sea dispute upends Asian summit, ASEAN summit actually." And some Voice of America came out with the news portraying it as a victory on the part of China upstaging the United States. Code of conduct blocked. They wanted to come out with a stronger code of conduct that would restrict the movement of China in the South China Sea. This did not come to pass because of the intervention of China. How far will Indonesia go? Then here's some news items of Phnom Penh. That's the Secretary of Foreign Secretary of Indonesia, and the trump card Philippines. Now, of course, we are into the not really. We were not into a competition as far as an arms race is concerned, but we announced already that we are buying 2 Italian warships. One warship, it's a second-hand Italian warship also, about 20 years old. The one warship frigate is about $6 billion each, so 6 billion pesos each. So the total package would be in the amount of 12 billion pesos. You can see that security is not cheap when it comes to something like this. But of course, in my case, I would like to think that another sounder approach is what we call asymmetrical warfare. We cannot match China warship versus warship, plane versus plane, in the same way that China cannot match the United States aircraft carrier by aircraft carrier. So what is China doing now? They're developing the Dongfeng missile, which according to them can hit a moving U.S. Navy aircraft carrier from about 2,000 kilometers away. So that is the threat in order to prevent the U.S. carrier from getting close to the China coastline. So, pag sa Tagalog, isang bala ka lang. Ito yung sabihin ng asymmetrical warfare. However big you are, it takes only one bullet to neutralize you. It takes only one missile to neutralize a $10 billion aircraft carrier. And similarly, we can do the same. We can have, instead of very expensive frigates, which can be neutralized with one missile, why not a number of missiles that can protect our exclusive economic zone, like these missiles that may be available from Norway. Maybe instead of 6 billion pesos, we can have this for about $200 billion, which has even a greater neutralizing capability than a frigate. Two frigates will have about 100 to 200 missiles that can target the frigates in the area. Range about 120 nautical miles. Good enough to protect, maybe even more, to protect our major part of our exclusive economic zone. And of course, of late, there are talks of an economic downtrend in China. This is both good news and bad news. Good news for us because it means lesser capability for them to modernize their armed forces, their military. Because for every item that we buy from China, for every dollar that we spend for a made in China product, maybe they're allocating 5 cents for their military, or maybe 10 cents. So every time we buy a made in China product, we are helping in modernizing their armed forces. But of course, a decline in the economy can also have what we call the unintended negative consequence on the part of the Philippine economy. We are exporting about $6 billion to them, and they're exporting about $6 billion to us. And any decline on their part will have an effect on a lot of businesses here. So this is something that is also very complicated. It's not that simple. China risks isolation if it occupies Spratlys. Of course, that is the foreseen consequence. If they do something very drastic and very radical, it would isolate them and would also affect the economy. But anything that would badly affect the economy would also have an effect on us. So again, it's not that simple. It is always very, very complicated. So that there's an article, one of the most scholarly papers that I've read on the South China Sea was made by a certain Jose Rizal Reyes, entitled "The Philippines-China Rivalry crossroads of the third millennium. And I'd like to quote an excerpt from his scholarly paper. By trying to grab our Scarborough Shoal, China is pointing a dagger at the rib side of our country. We should not waste this rare historic opportunity to summon Filipino courage and patriotism to the defense, putting our national house in order, unifying our people as never before, and unleashing the combined genius and energy of the Filipino nation for the benefit of the Philippines and our planet as a whole. This is what, that's the end of my quote. And this is what I call the possible upside. You know, the downside here is the very complicated security situation. But there's always a downside. The upside is that this could be a rallying point. You know, the one thing that makes us so different from the many countries in our midst that have progressed so dramatically is that those countries face some real threat. Many of them existential. Like, for example, Singapore was being threatened to be devoured by Malaysia. So they had to develop. South Korea was facing an existential threat in relation to North Korea. So because of that, it strengthened them. The threat strengthened them. Taiwan, the same thing. The threat from mainland China also strengthened them. But in our case, we're so complacent because we are securely surrounded by bodies of water, natural barriers to anyone who might have some ambition of occupying our territory. But that sense of complacency also affected our development strategy. Anybody who feels secure, who feels complacent and contented would behave in a complacent way and could have a retarding effect on its development and growth. So this is a very good paper, and I subscribe to its thesis that there is an upside. It can become a rallying point depending on how our leaders would utilize this as a rallying point. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that you have given me to share my thoughts on the Bajo de Masinloc issue from the Scarborough Shoal. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Golez. It was very educational. Actually, we always say that you can only have peace when you are enlightened.